It was supposed to be just another forgettable commute. The same crowded subway car, the same hum of dull conversations, and the same quiet resignation that came with the end of a long day. But that night as the train pulled into the station someone, caught my attention. The man looked ordinary at first glance. He sat near the end of the car, dressed in a weathered coat and holding a small leather-bound notebook. His graying hair framed a face lined with years of stories, and his piercing eyes seemed to take in everything around him. What stood out most was his demeanor, calm, almost serene, as if the chaos of the city couldn't touch him. I wouldn't have noticed him if not for the single strange act that followed. As the train doors slid shut, he stood abruptly and walked over to a woman sitting nearby. Without a word, he handed her a folded piece of paper and a faint smile before returning to his seat. The woman looked bewildered, hesitating before opening the note. Whatever was written inside made her gasp softly, her eyes welling with tears. Curiosity burned inside me. What could a stranger possibly write that would provoke such a reaction? I glanced at the man who now sat quietly, staring out the window as if nothing unusual had happened. I wanted to ask him to understand what had just unfolded, but before I could gather the courage, the train screeched to a halt, and he disappeared into the crowd. I didn't realize it yet, but that fleeting encounter would unravel a series of events that would change my life forever. 4 days after that train ride, I couldn't stop thinking about the man and the note. Who was he? What had he written that could evoke such a powerful reaction? The memory of the woman's tearful expression haunted me, and every time I stepped onto the subway, I found myself scanning the crowd, hoping to see him again. I started to imagine scenarios, piecing together stories in my head. Maybe he was a poet, scattering fragments of beauty in a world that often felt gray. Or perhaps he was someone who had experienced unimaginable pain and was now trying to heal others in his own quiet way. I even entertained the thought that he was part of some secret movement, anonymous acts of kindness meant to remind people of the good in humanity. But as the days turned into weeks, the man remained a mystery. I began to feel foolish for obsessing over a stranger. Life carried on, the routine of work and obligations pulling me back into its rhythm. Still, a part of me couldn't let go of that moment. It was as if I'd been given a glimpse into a story I wasn't meant to see, and now I was desperate to know how it ended. Then one evening it happened. I was sitting on the subway, lost in my thoughts, when I saw him. He was on the opposite side of the car, his notebook balanced on his lap as he wrote with deliberate care. My heart raced as I debated what to do. Should I approach him? What would I even say? Before I could decide, he looked up, and for a fleeting second our eyes met. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that felt knowing, as if he recognized me. I froze, unsure whether to smile or look away, but he nodded ever so slightly before returning to his writing. The train came to a stop and I watched as he stood, tucking his notebook into his coat pocket. This time I wasn't going to let him disappear. I grabbed my bag and followed him onto the platform, determined to get answers. As I stepped onto the platform, my heart pounded with equal parts excitement and nerves. The man walked at a leisurely pace, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. He didn't seem to notice me trailing a short distance behind him. I wasn't sure what I was going to say, but I knew I had to seize the moment. I had always been the kind of person who overthought everything. Spontaneity wasn't my strong suit, and approaching strangers was definitely out of my comfort zone. But there was something about this man, his quiet presence, the mystery surrounding him, that compelled me to act. Maybe it was because, deep down, I was searching for something too. My life had become a blur of routines, obligations, and quiet dissatisfaction, and I felt like I was sleepwalking through it all. I had a decent job at a marketing firm, but it didn't exactly set my soul on fire. Most days I felt like I was just going through the motions, ticking off tasks on an endless to-do list. My social life was equally uninspiring. A handful of acquaintances, casual Friday night drinks, and an unspoken sense of loneliness that crept in when the noise died down. It wasn't that I was unhappy exactly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. That's why the stranger on the train intrigued me so much. He seemed to embody the kind of calm and purpose I longed for, as if he had figured out something the rest of us hadn't. And then there was the note, the simple yet profound act of handing it to a stranger, knowing it would change her day, maybe even her life. I wanted to understand what drove him, what gave him that clarity. He exited the station and turned down a quiet side street, the kind lined with old brick buildings and flickering streetlights. I hesitated for a moment, feeling like a stalker, but my curiosity pushed me forward. Finally, summoning all my courage, I called out, "Excuse me." The man stopped and turned, his expression calm but curious. Up close, his presence was even more striking. There was a quiet wisdom in his eyes, a sense of patience that made me feel like he could see right through me. "Yes," he said, his voice low and steady. I saw you on the train a few weeks ago," I stammered, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "You gave a note to a woman." I couldn't stop wondering what it said. For a moment he simply studied me as if weighing my intentions. Then to my surprise he smiled. A small, knowing smile that made me feel both exposed and reassured. "It said what she needed to hear," he replied, his tone gentle but enigmatic. "And that's all that matters." His response only deepened the mystery. "What she needed to hear?" I echoed, frowning slightly. "How could you know that?" The man tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "It's not as complicated as it seems," he said. "Most people carry their struggles on the surface. If you pay attention, you can see it in their posture, their expressions, even the way they hold their breath when they're trying to keep it together." I stared at him, taken aback. His words made sense, but they also seemed impossibly perceptive. "So, you just read people?" I asked, my curiosity overtaking my nervousness. "In a way," he admitted. "But it's more about listening, to what they're saying and to what they're not. People don't always know how to ask for help, but that doesn't mean they don't need it." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt a pang of recognition. I thought about the countless times I had put on a brave face, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. How often had someone looked past the surface and really seen me? The answer was almost never. "So why do you do it?" I asked, my voice softer now. "Why give strangers notes instead of just talking to them?" The man's smile faded slightly, replaced by a distant look. "Because sometimes words on a page can reach people in a way a conversation can't," he said. "A note is private. It's something they can hold on to, something they can return to when they're ready." I nodded, his explanation striking a chord. There was something poetic about the idea of leaving pieces of kindness for others to find. But it also made me wonder about his own story. "And you?" I ventured. "What do you hold on to?" He hesitated, his eyes flickering with an emotion I couldn't quite place. For the first time he seemed less composed, as if I had touched on something deeply personal. "That's a story for another time," he said finally, his tone gentle but firm. As I walked away from our brief conversation that night, my mind buzzed with questions. Who was this man really? His insights and demeanor hinted at a life filled with stories, but he had kept his own truths tightly guarded. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he let on. Over the next few days I found myself looking for him again, half hoping and half dreading another encounter. I tried to rationalize my curiosity. Maybe it was the novelty of meeting someone so enigmatic. Maybe it was because, deep down, I wanted answers, not just about him but about myself. Whatever the reason, I knew that if I saw him again, I wouldn't let the conversation end so easily. Then one rainy evening I spotted him. He was sitting on a bench at a quiet park near my apartment, his notebook open on his lap as raindrops splattered against the pages. Without thinking, I approached him, clutching my umbrella tightly. "Writing in the rain?" I asked, my voice laced with nervous humor. He looked up, startled at first, but then he smiled faintly. "The rain has a way of clearing the mind," he said. "Besides, inspiration doesn't wait for sunny days." I gestured toward the empty spot on the bench. "Pay I?" He nodded and I sat down, adjusting the umbrella to cover us both. For a moment we simply listened to the rain, the rhythmic patter filling the silence between us. Finally I broke the quiet. "You never told me your name." "It's Caleb," he said, his voice calm but hesitant, as if he rarely shared this detail. "Nice to meet you, Caleb," I said. "I'm Emma." He nodded, repeating my name softly as though committing it to memory. "Emma," he said, "you ask a lot of questions." "I can't help it," I admitted, smiling slightly. "You're not exactly an easy person to figure out." "Maybe you're not supposed to figure me out," he replied, his tone teasing but with an undercurrent of seriousness. "Sometimes it's better to let the mystery be." I laughed lightly, but his words stayed with me. Caleb had a way of making every statement feel significant, like a clue to some greater understanding. "You're good at deflecting," I said, leaning back slightly. But I'm still going to ask. Why the notes? Why not just live your life and let people figure out their own? Caleb didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed his notebook, the worn leather cover creaking slightly, and rested his hands on his knees. There was a time when I needed someone to see me, he said finally. To remind me that I wasn't invisible. That I mattered. The weight of his words hung between us. Did someone do that for you? I asked softly. He hesitated, then nodded. Not in the way I do it for others, but yes. A stranger's kindness saved me once. It wasn't a grand gesture or a life-changing revelation. It was something small. A moment of connection when I felt completely alone. I've never forgotten it. I wanted to press him for more details, but the look in his eyes stopped me. It wasn't just sadness. It was something deeper, a wound still healing. And now you're paying it forward, I said, more to myself than to him. Caleb smiled faintly. You could say that. Or maybe I'm just selfish. Maybe I do it because it makes me feel less alone. That's not selfish, I countered. It's human. For the first time, Caleb's smile reached his eyes. You're kinder than you give yourself credit for, he said. Most people wouldn't stop to ask the questions you do. His comment caught me off guard and I felt a flush of warmth rise to my cheeks. I just want to understand, I said. People. Life. All of it. Caleb studied me for a moment, then opened his notebook and began writing. What are you doing? I asked, craning my neck to see. Giving you what you need, he said cryptically, tearing out a page and folding it neatly. He handed it to me, his expression unreadable. Don't open it yet. Not until you're alone. My heart pounded as I took the note, its weight far heavier than the thin piece of paper should allow. Why? I asked, clutching it tightly. Because some things make more sense in solitude, he replied. And because I think you're ready to see it. I walked home that night with the folded piece of paper burning a hole in my pocket. The rain had eased to a drizzle and the quiet streets gave me too much time to think. What could Caleb have written? Why had he been so insistent that I wait to read it? My curiosity itched at me, but I forced myself to honor his request. Once I got home, I kicked off my wet shoes, draped my coat over a chair and sat at the edge of my bed. My apartment felt unusually still, as if it were holding its breath with me. Finally, I took out the note, my fingers trembling slightly as I unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and oddly familiar. The words were simple, yet they struck me like a bolt of lightning. You don't need to have all the answers right now. It's okay to feel lost. Just don't stop looking. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I read the message again and again. It was as though Caleb had reached into the deepest part of me and pulled out the one thing I didn't even realize I needed to hear. For months, maybe years, I had been carrying a quiet desperation, the fear that I was running out of time to figure out my life. But here was someone telling me it was okay to be unsure, to take things one step at a time. The note stayed on my bedside table that night, a small but powerful reminder that I wasn't alone in my struggles. And yet it raised even more questions. How had Caleb known? Was it just a lucky guess, or did he see something in me that even I couldn't see? The next day I decided I needed to talk to him again. I went back to the park where I'd found him before, clutching the note in my hand like a talisman. But the bench was empty and Caleb was nowhere to be seen. Disappointment washed over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of our story. Days turned into weeks and Caleb seemed to have vanished. I returned to the park several times, each visit filled with hope that I might spot him sitting on the familiar bench with his notebook. But each time the bench remained empty and I left feeling more adrift than before. The note he had given me stayed with me, though, folded neatly and tucked into my journal, where I reread it whenever doubts began to creep in. I began to notice small changes in myself. The note had planted a seed, a reminder to slow down and stop pressuring myself to have everything figured out. I started journaling more, letting my thoughts spill onto the page without judgment. I even picked up an old hobby, painting, that I had abandoned years ago. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress, a tiny light breaking through the fog of my routine. Still, questions about Caleb lingered. Who was he really? Why had he chosen to share that moment with me? And why did it feel like he had appeared at exactly the right time in my life, only to disappear just as suddenly? One evening as I walked home from work, I spotted something that made my heart stop. Taped to a lamppost near the subway station was a piece of paper, written in the same familiar handwriting as Caleb's note. It wasn't addressed to anyone specifically, but the words felt like they were meant for me. When you stop searching for answers, you might find what you didn't know you were looking for. I pulled the paper down and held it tightly, my mind racing. Was this a message from Caleb? Had he been leaving these notes all along, scattered throughout the city for anyone to find? The idea was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it meant I wasn't the only one he had reached, unsettling because it reminded me how little I knew about him. Fueled by curiosity, I decided to search for more notes. Over the next few days, I scoured the city, paying closer attention to lampposts, benches, and bulletin boards. It felt like a scavenger hunt, each discovery filling me with a mix of excitement and longing. Each note carried a different message, but they all had the same tone, gentle, wise, and deeply personal. One crisp autumn morning, my search led me to an unexpected discovery. I had been walking through a quieter part of the city, far from my usual routes, when I noticed another note pinned to a community board outside a small cafe. Its familiar handwriting drew me in like a magnet. Sometimes the people who touch our lives the most are the ones who don't stay. The words struck me deeply, but it wasn't just the message that caught my attention. Below the note was a small flyer advertising a local storytelling event happening that very evening. The title read, "The Power of Words, Stories That Heal." At the bottom, in small print, was the name of the featured speaker, Caleb Harper. My heart leaped. I couldn't believe it. After weeks of searching, I finally had a lead, a chance to see him again and maybe even get the answers I had been longing for. Without hesitation, I cleared my schedule and made plans to attend. That evening, I arrived at the venue, a cozy, dimly lit bookstore tucked into a quiet corner of the city. The room was packed, every seat filled with more people standing at the back. I found a spot near the edge, close enough to see the small stage where a microphone and a single stool had been set up. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation and I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. When Caleb stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. He looked just as I remembered, calm, composed, with that same quiet confidence that had captivated me on the subway. But this time he seemed different, more open, as if the stage itself gave him permission to let down his guard. He began to speak, his voice steady and thoughtful. "Words have always been my anchor," he said. "They've carried me through the darkest times and reminded me of the light that still exists in the world. Tonight I want to share a story about how a stranger's kindness saved my life." Caleb's words filled the room, each one deliberate, each one weighted with meaning. "Years ago," he began, "I was at my lowest point. I had lost my job, my home, and my sense of purpose. I was alone, drifting from place to place, not knowing where I was headed or if I even wanted to keep going." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the audience as if inviting each of us to step into that moment with him. "One night I found myself sitting on a park bench in a city I didn't recognize. It was cold and I was hungry, but more than anything I felt invisible. Like if I disappeared no one would notice. I felt my breath catch as he continued, his voice tinged with vulnerability. That's when it happened. A stranger, a woman I had never seen before, sat down beside me. She didn't ask me what was wrong, didn't pry or offer advice. She simply handed me a small card and said, 'I think you need this.' Then she stood up and walked away." Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a weathered card, holding it up for everyone to see. The card said, "You matter more than you know. Don't give up." No name, no explanation. But those words, they saved me. The room was silent, the weight of his story settling over us like a blanket. "That moment changed everything," he said. "I carried that card with me everywhere, and every time I felt like giving up, I'd look at it and remind myself that someone somewhere believed I was worth saving. And eventually I started to believe it too." I felt tears welling in my eyes, the raw honesty of his story striking a chord deep within me. Caleb smiled faintly, his expression both grateful and wistful. "That's why I do what I do now. Because I know what it's like to need a lifeline. And if my words can be that lifeline for someone else, even for a moment, then it's worth it." As Caleb's story unfolded, I noticed a shift in the room. The people around me seemed to lean in closer, their expressions softening as his words resonated with their own unspoken struggles. It wasn't just a story he was telling. It was a connection he was building, one fragile thread at a time. He continued, "I never saw that woman again and I never learned her name. But I like to think she wasn't just helping me, she was helping herself too. Sometimes the kindness we show others is what we wish we could give ourselves." The truth in his words hit me like a wave. How often had I ignored my own needs, pouring energy into helping others while neglecting the parts of me that felt broken? Caleb wasn't just speaking to the room, he was speaking directly to me, and I could feel the tears threatening to spill over. Caleb's voice softened, his gaze turning inward. Over time I started leaving notes for others the way she had done for me. At first it felt strange, like I was stepping into her shoes without permission. But the more I did it, the more I realized that those small acts of kindness weren't about me. They were about the people who found them, the ones who might be sitting on their own metaphorical bench, wondering if they mattered. He glanced down at his hands, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of the card he still held. And the thing is, I'll never know if those notes made a difference. Maybe most of them ended up in the trash. But that's okay. It's not about knowing. It's about trusting that sometimes, the smallest gesture can ripple outward in ways we can't imagine. The audience erupted into applause, but I stayed still, my hands trembling slightly. Caleb's story wasn't just inspiring, it was transformative. It made me see the threads of my own life in a different light, the invisible connections that had shaped me in ways I hadn't realized. When the applause died down, Caleb stepped off the stage and disappeared into the crowd. I wanted to follow him to thank him for what he had shared, but something held me back. Maybe it was the realization that this, too, was part of his magic, letting people take what they needed and carry it forward on their own. After the event, I walked home in a daze, Caleb's words echoing in my mind. The weight of his story, the raw honesty he had shared, and the quiet power of his journey, it all felt like a mirror reflecting my own doubts and questions. For so long I had been searching for something, not even knowing what it was. Now, I wondered if what I'd been looking for all along wasn't an answer, but a connection. The note he had given me months ago had been my lifeline, just as that stranger's card had been his. It made me realize that I wasn't as alone as I thought. My struggles, my uncertainties, they weren't unique. They were part of the shared human experience, the invisible threads that tied us all together. But as much as Caleb's words had inspired me, they also left me with new questions. How could he give so much to others when his own story was still tinged with pain? Did he ever feel the same doubts I did, the fear that his efforts might not be enough? And most importantly, how could I carry forward what he had shown me in my own life? Determined to find clarity, I went back to the park where we had first talked. The bench was empty as I expected, but it felt different now, less like a place of longing and more like a quiet sanctuary. I sat there for hours, letting my thoughts settle like leaves in the breeze. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to just be. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a small glimmer of light caught my eye. Taped to the side of the bench was another note, written in Caleb's unmistakable handwriting. The hardest part isn't finding the light, it's choosing to see it. I stared at the note for what felt like an eternity, choosing to see the light. The words struck something deep within me, like they were meant to guide me through the haze of my own doubts. Caleb's notes weren't just random acts of kindness. They were deliberate reminders of the strength and clarity we all carried within ourselves, even when we couldn't see it. That night I made a choice. I couldn't just sit with the inspiration Caleb had given me. I had to do something with it. I went home, pulled out my journal, and started writing. At first, the words came hesitantly, like a trickle breaking through a dam. But soon they flowed freely. My fears, my frustrations, the moments I had felt invisible, and the small, unexpected connections that had reminded me I wasn't alone. By the time I closed the journal, the first rays of dawn were peeking through my window. For the first time in years, I felt lighter, as if some unseen burden had been lifted. But writing wasn't enough. I needed to take the next step, to give back in the same way Caleb had given to me. I began leaving my own notes around the city. They weren't as profound as Caleb's. Simple messages like "You're stronger than you think," or "Take it one day at a time." But as I taped the first one to a lamppost near my building, I felt a rush of nervous energy. What if no one noticed? What if people thought it was silly? But then I remembered Caleb's words. It's not about knowing, it's about trusting. And so I trusted. I started leaving more notes, on park benches, in coffee shop napkin holders, and tucked between the pages of library books. Each one felt like a small act of hope, a tiny gesture that might ripple outward in ways I'd never see. As the days passed, I began to notice subtle changes, not just in myself but in the world around me. Occasionally I'd spot someone picking up one of my notes, their expressions softening as they read it. Once I saw a woman slip a note into her purse with a small, grateful smile. Another time, a teenager paused on a park bench holding one of my notes tightly in his hand before looking around as if searching for who had left it. Those moments weren't grand or life-altering, but they were enough. They reminded me that even the smallest acts could create a spark in someone's day. And as much as I wanted to believe I was helping others, I knew the truth. These notes were helping me just as much. They were my way of reclaiming a sense of purpose, of reminding myself that I wasn't powerless in a world that often felt overwhelming. One evening, as I was taping a note to a lamppost near the subway station, a voice behind me made me freeze. "You're doing good work." I turned, my heart skipping a beat, and there he was, Caleb. He stood a few steps away, his hands in his pockets and a faint smile playing on his lips. "I thought I recognized your handwriting," he added, nodding toward the note. For a moment I was too stunned to speak. "You noticed?" I finally managed, my voice shaky with disbelief. "Hard not to," he said, his tone warm but teasing. "You're using my method after all." I laughed nervously, feeling a mix of embarrassment and pride. "I guess I am. I didn't think that I'd see you again." Caleb's smile deepened. "Sometimes the universe has a funny way of bringing things full circle." I felt a swell of emotions. Relief, excitement, even a little apprehension. Caleb's presence was like a puzzle piece clicking into place, yet I couldn't help but wonder why he had reappeared now after all this time. "I thought you disappeared," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I've been around," he replied, his gaze steady. "But I wanted to see what you'd do with the space I left." I tilted my head, trying to make sense of his words. "You mean you left on purpose?" "In a way," Caleb admitted, his tone thoughtful. "People grow most when they have the room to figure things out on their own. You didn't need me to guide you. You needed to trust yourself." His words hit me harder than I expected. I realized that his absence hadn't been abandonment. It had been a gift. Without him, I might never have taken the steps to explore my own voice, my own ability to make an impact. "So what now?" I asked, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Are you here to grade my notes?" Caleb chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "No grades. Just curiosity. You've done more than I expected, and I wanted to see it for myself." We stood there for a moment, the air between us filled with unspoken understanding. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice steady. "For everything. You gave me a lifeline when I didn't even realize I needed one." Caleb nodded, his expression kind. "That's the beauty of connection. Sometimes we don't even realize we're holding someone else up just by being there." As he turned to leave, I felt a pang of sadness, but it was accompanied by a sense of closure. Caleb wasn't a mystery to solve or a guide to follow. He was a reminder of the power we all had to lift each other, even in the smallest ways. After Caleb walked away that night, I stayed on the sidewalk for a long time, staring at the note I had just taped to the lamppost. His words echoed in my mind. Sometimes, we don't even realize we're holding someone else up just by being there. For so long I had thought of Caleb as a guide, someone who had all the answers. But now I realized he was just as human as the rest of us, navigating his own journey while helping others along the way. That realization changed the way I saw myself, and the world around me. I began to notice small acts of kindness everywhere I looked. A stranger holding the door open for someone carrying groceries, a child sharing their snack with a classmate, a barista offering a free coffee to someone who looked like they were having a bad day. These moments had always been there, but I had been too caught up in my own worries to see them. Inspired by Caleb, I started to approach my notes differently. Instead of simply leaving them in random places, I began observing the people around me, trying to sense who might need a little encouragement. At a coffee shop, I left a note on the counter for the exhausted-looking cashier. On the subway, I slipped one into the pocket of a man who looked like he hadn't smiled in weeks. Each time, I felt a little more connected to the world, as if I were weaving threads of light into the lives of strangers. One day, I was walking through the park when I noticed a young woman sitting alone on a bench, her head bowed and her shoulders slumped. Something about her posture reminded me of myself on those days when everything felt like too much. I hesitated, then approached her with a note I had written earlier that morning. "Excuse me," I said gently, holding out the folded paper. "I think you might need this." The woman looked up, her eyes red and puffy, and took the note with trembling hands. She opened it, her expression softening as she read the words. "You are stronger than you think, and you're not alone." She looked back at me, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea how much I needed this." Her reaction stayed with me long after I left the park that day. It wasn't just the gratitude in her voice. It was the way she held onto the note, clutching it as if it were a lifeline. I realized then that the act of giving wasn't just about the words on the paper. It was about the connection it created, however brief, and the reminder that someone cared enough to see her. That single moment became a turning point for me. I started looking for more opportunities to connect, not just through notes but in everyday interactions. I found myself striking up conversations with strangers, offering compliments to people who seemed like they could use a little boost, and even volunteering at a local shelter. Each interaction felt like a small ripple in a much larger pond, a reminder that even the smallest gestures could have a profound impact. Through these experiences, I began to rebuild parts of myself I hadn't even realized were broken. My confidence grew not in some grand transformative way but in quiet, steady steps. The fear of not having all the answers, of not knowing where my life was headed, began to fade. In its place was a newfound trust in the process, a belief that I didn't need to have everything figured out to make a difference. As I became more comfortable with this new version of myself, I noticed something else. The connections I was making weren't just one-sided. The more I gave, the more I received. A simple conversation with a stranger at a cafe turned into a meaningful exchange of ideas. A note I left on a subway seat inspired someone to leave one of their own, creating a chain reaction I could have never anticipated. One particularly memorable moment came when I received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain with no return address, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakably Caleb's. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "You're doing exactly what you're meant to do. Keep going." Tears filled my eyes as I read the words. Caleb had always been a presence in my life, even when he wasn't physically there. His letter reminded me that our stories didn't have to be solitary. We could carry pieces of each other forward, building something greater than ourselves. Caleb's letter reignited a spark within me, reminding me that my small efforts were part of something larger. It wasn't about the size of the gesture. It was about the intent behind it. His words became my mantra, echoing in my mind whenever doubt crept in. "You're doing exactly what you're meant to do." Over time, I started to notice how the ripples I'd created were spreading in ways I hadn't anticipated. A local bookstore owner told me they'd found one of my notes tucked into a book and decided to keep it pinned by the cash register, where it had become a small but cherished part of their space. A coworker stumbled upon one I'd left near our office and shared how it had brightened their day, unaware it had come from me. These stories reminded me that Caleb's philosophy was true. We don't need to know how far our actions reach to trust they matter. As the weeks turned into months, I also began to notice changes within myself. The feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt that had once defined me were fading. I wasn't perfect, not even close, but I was okay with that. I started to see my life as a work in progress, one where the journey was just as important as the destination. One evening, as I was writing a new batch of notes, I paused to reflect on how far I had come. My journal was filled with pages of thoughts, ideas, and experiences I never would have explored before meeting Caleb. My apartment, once a quiet and sterile place, now felt alive with color and creativity, thanks to the art projects I'd started revisiting. Most importantly, I had learned to embrace uncertainty. The questions that had once haunted me, about my purpose, my direction, my worth, no longer felt so heavy. Instead, they felt like opportunities, open doors leading to possibilities I hadn't yet imagined. One day while walking through the park, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. A young boy, no older than 10, was sitting on the same bench where I had first spoken with Caleb. In his hand was one of my notes, and he was reading it with a look of quiet concentration. I approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Hi," I said softly, and he looked up, his eyes wide but not afraid. "Did you write this?" he asked, holding up the note. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I did." He looked back at the note, his little hands gripping it tightly. "It's nice." It made me feel better. My heart swelled. "I'm glad," I said. "Sometimes a few kind words can make a big difference." He nodded solemnly, then tucked the note into his pocket. "I think I'm gonna keep it," he said. "Maybe I'll show my mom. She's been really sad lately." Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes. "That's a wonderful idea," I told him. "You can even write your own notes if you want." Sometimes sharing something kind can make you feel better too. The boy smiled, a small but genuine expression that felt like sunshine breaking through the clouds. Maybe I will, he said before hopping off the bench and running toward the playground, the note still safely in his pocket. As I watched him go, a wave of emotions washed over me. That simple interaction reminded me why I had started this journey in the first place. Not to fix anyone or solve every problem, but to remind people even in the smallest ways that they weren't alone. Later that evening I sat down to write another note, but this one wasn't for a stranger. It was for me. In bold, deliberate handwriting I wrote, "You've come so far. Don't stop now." I placed it on my bedside table, a reminder that the kindness I showed others also had to extend to myself. Months after my journey with Caleb began, I found myself reflecting on how much my life had changed. The notes I had started leaving around the city were no longer just an act of kindness. They had become a part of who I was. Each message felt like a small piece of myself left behind, a reminder to others and to me, that even in our darkest moments, connection and hope could always be found. I began to notice how these small gestures were shaping the people around me. Friends and coworkers started sharing their own stories of leaving notes or acts of kindness inspired by my actions. One colleague who had once seemed distant and guarded, told me she had started writing notes for her teenage daughter, slipping them into her lunchbox each morning. "She doesn't say much about them," she admitted, "but I know she reads them. It feels like a little way to remind her I'm here." Hearing stories like these felt like a ripple effect, spreading far beyond anything I could have imagined. The simple idea Caleb had passed on to me, just a few meaningful words left for someone who needed them, was becoming something much bigger. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about the connections those notes created, the hope they sparked, and the conversations they started. But it wasn't just about the notes. The real transformation had come from within. I had spent so long searching for answers, for validation, for a sense of purpose that felt just out of reach. Meeting Caleb had shown me that those things didn't come from someone else. They came from within. The power to change my life, to find meaning and joy, had been mine all along. I just needed a nudge to see it. One day as I flipped through the pages of my journal, I came across the first note Caleb had ever given me. The words still carried the same weight they had the day I'd read them. "You don't need to have all the answers right now. It's okay to feel lost. Just don't stop looking." Struck me how far I had come since that moment. Back then I had been consumed by doubt, endlessly questioning whether I was on the right path. But now I realized the journey wasn't about finding a perfect answer. It was about embracing the uncertainty and continuing to move forward, step by step. Caleb's note had been my starting point, but it was the connections I had made along the way. The boy on the park bench, my coworker's quiet confession, the strangers whose faces lit up when they read my notes, that had truly shaped my journey. Each of those moments reminded me that life wasn't meant to be figured out in isolation. It was meant to be shared, even in small, fleeting ways. I started writing notes for myself more often, small reminders to stay kind, patient, and open. They weren't elaborate, just little slips of paper I'd tuck into my wallet, my mirror, or the corners of my notebook. "Be proud of how far you've come. It's okay to rest. You're doing better than you think." These messages became my anchors, pulling me back when self-doubt threatened to creep in. One evening I decided to write Caleb a letter. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again or if he even had an address where I could send it, but it felt important to put my gratitude into words. I wrote about how his kindness had changed my perspective, how his note had set off a chain reaction that had transformed not only my life but the lives of so many others. As I sealed the envelope, I smiled, knowing that even if Caleb never read it, the act of writing it was enough. It was my way of closing the loop, of honoring the connection we had shared. In the months that followed, I continued to weave Caleb's influence into my everyday life. Each note I left, each small act of kindness I offered, felt like a continuation of the lessons he had taught me. I no longer needed to see him to feel his presence. It was in the words I wrote, the connections I built, and the moments of hope I witnessed. One day while walking through the park, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. A small group of people had gathered near the bench where I had first met Caleb. They were holding pieces of paper, reading them aloud, and sharing stories. Curious, I approached, listening quietly from the edge of the group. "This one says, 'Your story matters. Don't be afraid to share it,'" a woman read, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Another man spoke up, holding a note of his own. Mine says, even in the hardest moments you are not alone. The group began to talk, their voices overlapping as they shared how they had found the notes and what they meant to them. Some had discovered them on subway seats or pinned to bulletin boards. Others had stumbled upon them in coffee shops or tucked into library books. Each note had a story attached, a ripple that had reached someone in their moment of need. I stood there, overwhelmed by the realization that what Caleb had started, and what I had continued, had grown into something far greater than either of us. This wasn't just about one person leaving notes. It was about a community, a shared understanding that even the smallest gestures could create meaningful connections. As the group began to disperse, a woman approached me, holding a note I recognized as one I had written weeks earlier. "This was yours, wasn't it?" she asked, her expression warm and knowing. I nodded, unable to hide my smile. "Yeah. It was." She smiled back, tucking the note into her pocket. "Thank you for this and for reminding us all that sometimes, the smallest things make the biggest difference." As the woman walked away, her words lingered in my mind. Sometimes the smallest things make the biggest difference. That simple truth had been the thread connecting everything. The notes, the stories, and the quiet, unseen ripples they had created. I realized then that I didn't need to know the full impact of my actions. The beauty of it was in the not knowing, in trusting that the words would find their way to the people who needed them most. That evening, I sat by my window watching the city lights twinkle against the dark sky. I thought about Caleb, the stranger who had handed me a lifeline when I didn't even know I needed one. His words had given me permission to embrace my uncertainties, to let go of the need for perfect answers and instead focus on the journey. I opened my journal and wrote down a new note, one I felt summed up everything I had learned. Sometimes the most meaningful connections are the ones we can't see. As I stared at the words, a wave of gratitude washed over me, not just for Caleb but for everyone I had met along the way. The boy on the bench, the co-workers who shared their stories, the strangers who carried my notes in their pockets. They had all become part of a larger story, one that reminded me how deeply interconnected we all were. In the end, Caleb had been right. We don't have to see the full picture to know that we're making a difference. Sometimes, it's enough to take the first step, to trust that even the smallest actions can light the way for someone else. And as I closed my journal, I knew that I would keep leaving those notes not because I had to but because I wanted to. Because the light they created wasn't just for others. It was for me too.